Avant tout, je veux dire que je suis très désolée de ne pouvoir pas faire cette présentation en français, mais il y a des choses qu'on ne doit pas faire en une langue. Et pourtant, je vous invite à la recherche de points communs aussi en anglais. In his Sueño de Juicio Final, also known as The Vision of the Skulls, Francisco Quevedo paints a picture of Judgment Day filled with witticisms. In the early 17th century text, part of his Sueños y Discursos de Verdades Descubridoras de Abusos, Vicios y Engaños, he mocks other faiths, antiquity, and the professions of his day. When the devils seize an advocate who is blamed for all his rights having left, so to speak, they uncover a second man covering behind him, on all fours, trying to hide. Asked who he is, the man replies, an actor, cómico. But the devil in charge corrects him, farandulero, a traveling con artist, nothing more. And that he could have saved himself the journey to the judgment that ever continues because he had to be well aware of how things are. So the farandulero swears to leave, and on his word, he goes to hell. This bit from Quevedo is not linked to Camus, not that we know of, as little as Quevedo is generally linked to writing for the stage. But this prose sample exemplifies very well just how much a certain theatrality as a relational space and as a practice to be polished is ingrained into Siglo de Oro thought, beyond theater at large. It may be precisely this way of thinking theater, I will argue in this paper, that contributes to a specifically Spanish Baroque theater culture that, as we know, later attracted Camus' attention in his working with Calderón, Lope, Tirso, as well as Rojas. While this concept of theatrality is not new and has in fact seen considerable traction in the 1990s and early 2000s, prominently within the work of Helma Schramm of Berlin or Rudolf Münz of Mainz, and also in transdisciplinary approaches within life sciences, the connection between theater as a relational thought system and Spanish tradition has remained as of yet largely unexplored. This hypothesis of matching Camus' drive to a specifically Spanish impulse of action and relation comes with two small avant-propos. One, that despite his genetics, despite his involvements with Spanish expats and his knowledge of and investment in Spanish politics, we already have mentioned today earlier the revolt in Asturias, based on the 34 Oviedo uprisings, Camus also fashions himself upon the Spanish other, a trope popular in European culture in the early 20th century. Camus did not spend much time in Spain. We have in the previous presentation heard that he had to learn Spanish. Yet he understood himself as being Spanish by second nature, beyond the fact of his birth. His grasp on Spanish Baroque dramaturgy notwithstanding, he also used Spain as a cipher and a projection space, particularly in the political. The Spanish Civil War was a narrative for the international left to orient themselves within fascist Europe, superimposed even on the idea of Spain as an exotic locale of a more primal nature. Camus' Spain, thus, is also a politicized projection that showcases the dealings with the rigor and the fatality of a Baroque mind frame. Two, we're getting to number two. Also, the Siglo de Oro needs to be read as an idealized, politicized cipher in this context, employed to establish legitimation, for example, in the Reconquista context, and to fashion a national narrative under varying political systems. It is used both, particularly in the 20th century, both in fascist and anti-fascist self-fashionings. What is commonly understood as Siglo de Oro theater culture has obviously not suddenly risen up in the 16th century. It is, even in its then contemporary shapings, the result of constant negotiation, of practices that are included or discarded in a newly professionalized environment. Literacy was one strategy of inclusion, yet just one strand of tradition incorporated into what was to be known as Spanish Baroque theater. And even in the written spaces of Calderón, of Lope, or also of Quevedo of Cervantes, one of the Siglo de Oro core repertory, images of older, non-literary traditions are still visible. Figures at the markets, threads of argumentation. their echo can be traced through Baroque theatre and perhaps as a positioning even reaches across the centuries as a proactive grasp on fatality as a determinist given. It does then not seem that far removed from Camus' own philosophical positions. The traditions and practices mentioned link all the way back to pre-Christian belief systems that have been exceptionally well and lastingly preserved in Spain, thanks to the extensive religious festive cultures. In many cases, remnants of an older anthropological model have in this manner survived until the early 20th century, when a growing awareness of national folklore history helped instigate ethnological recollections of its knowledges. The particular blend of religiousness, rural poverty, and political instability that has characterized Spain for much of its modern history has, in this instance, managed to preserve a wealth lost in most other European countries. Most of these practices are oral-based, removed from literacy, and a later pinning down or cultivating integration into canon usually entails a fair share of censorship and refashioning, as can be seen, for example, within the genre of the mochiganga, upon which I will touch in a minute. Why then do I talk here when we are looking at one writer being influenced by other writers about a space beyond literacy? And the answer to this is threefold. The easiest being that, of course, theater writing, as the link between Camus and most of his investment in Siglo de Oro works, is generally already dealing with a dimension of performativity beyond the written page. Second, theater writings show reflexes of theater practices beyond the accepted scope. Policing theater makes the actual variety of theater visible, much of which happens, particularly in the early modern age, outside written culture. And third, theater as a relational set of practices requires at times an independence from philological approaches, its appearance in text notwithstanding, and works purely as a perspective as well. Which leaves us with three approaches. One that counts on a dimension beyond the text, one which looks at the text as an access to spaces beyond, and one which problematizes a practice writing relation at large. The latter one being particularly noteworthy when it comes to Siglo de Oro research, which is per default a heavily writing-oriented space, both because Spain does not have performance studies as an institutional research branch, and because as an epoch it is largely read through its written output. Spaces beyond the text as an integral part of theater research are then, perhaps, particularly of note when it comes to Siglo de Oro theater. They reflect research turns of the last decades or two regarding authorship and concepts that emphasize cultural activity instead of works. Some of you may be familiar with Christopher Small's tome on musicking, to borrow an example from a neighboring discipline. And it leaves us perhaps with an attempt of an answer as to what lies underneath the appealing Spanishness of Baroque Iberian theater, among which Camus singled out the action and the quick rhythm that move, one might argue, also beyond the written or spoken word in its musicality, and also as a way of confronting and structuring the world. When in his brief preface to his adaptation of the Caballero de Almeda, he quotes Meredith's dictum of Un battement précipité de pied, I am taken back to the dancers and performers of the early Baroque who, still out of professional structure of theater, signaled their approach to the world as a rhythm, a limp or a jump that denoted the outsider's perspective that could deal with what we might more modernly term the absurdity of life. Monica Rauter, in examining Camus' relation to Spain, mentions in an attempt at comparing Camus and Lorca as theater people that to analyze the theater work of both authors, the tools of philology would not be sufficient. It warrants mentioning that within Spanish philology, a variety of approaches from cultural studies or ethnology have been self-consciously applied in recent years and yielded results that allow further interdisciplinary research, also on behalf of performance studies, for example in Buerto's exploration of the mochiganga as a genre. What then is the unknown, the unspoken that threads at times as an echo of an alternative perspective through the mainstream texts? The example of Quevedo and his devil, who is so angry with the actor who fashions himself an actor, and not as a fraud, allows us a glimpse at the early modern hierarchy of theater practices. The troops that occupied the stages of the corrales were but the tip of the iceberg, and even within that context, the figure of the actor lived with the umbrella of being a social outcast, removed from honorable professions and moral propriety. But even in this rejection, we can find in Quevedo's farandulero, who on his word goes to hell and probably walks right out again, a reflection of dealing with death in a different manner, laughing it away, and managing the fear of it through tales of journeys beyond, as explored, for example, by Carlo Ginzburg, who called the journey to the other world the core of all narratives. Professional theater depends on professional actors and actresses, whose predecessors operated in spaces without written drama or comedy. Most of them were either part of festive or religious subcultures and only slowly transferred to the professional realm of the organized stage. Beggars, pilgrims, goliards, nomadic peddlers, charlatans, mask bearers. Early modern performers often covered more than one of these bases and brought their knowledge and techniques to the later professional theater and its genres as comedia o auto, loa or entremés. An interesting and widely circulated systemation of performers, most of you here will likely know it, is available in Rojas, whose Celestina Camus eventually staged. The text in question here is El viaje entretenido, where Rojas differentiates between troops by size, which he then connects directly to income and prestige. As you can see here, the listing of available troop formats at the time in Bululu, Ñaque, Gangaria, and so on. Rojas, as a troop leader and actor himself, certainly had ample insight into the landscape of acting around 1600. His listing, however, is owing much to the Baroque trope of designing fable systems and cannot be taken at face value in this instance. His fantastic genealogy of performance, depending on sleep sites and foods, and a lot about who eats what sausage and carries it where on his body, refers to this kind of narrative style. Of interest here is rather his perspective, which has him draw a progressive line from the single outcast performer to the large companies of actors and actresses who take the corrales of the cities and who have already distanced themselves from older, more eminently physical forms of knowledge and the transferal of such knowledge. Still, it is likely that the stage reality Rojas knew also informed his listing, and we find in it, in fact, evidence of widely known medieval and early modern practices. Let's take a brief look at the first and poorest performance style he mentions, the bululu. With its repetitive, nonsensical sound, it bears resemblance to the rhymes and style of the Italian turlu turlu that, to sum it up, function as a shorthand for a set of practices and beliefs distilled into trickster-like figures. It brings us back to the rhythm as a fundamental element of performance and of performing and preserving knowledge, a vital point in a culture that depends on oral organization. If the bululu at its core is a single traveling performer who tells tales against food and a place to sleep, we are close again to the beggars or the traveling priests under a vow of poverty who are linked to a life at the margins. We can also see here that a set or costumes are not at play. At the core of this performance type is the rhapsodic narration, likely in combination with a repertory of physical gestures. The bululu is also referenced again in Quevedo, again in the Sueños, when he states in the Tauras de Plutón that it is at the very bottom of the acting pit. From a moral perspective, Quevedo fits all sorts of moral miscreants as buffones, proclaiming that everyone is a buffon, to which he then adds two further variants. One, those who move from house to house alone or in pairs, which is in concordance with Rojas' description of the bululu, and those who move in gaggles and whom he describes as a plague. If they wouldn't come for us, we certainly wouldn't search them out. So, as in, we may all be bouffons, but you don't make a living out of that. This performer is someone who talks from the margins of a society, with their slow integration into society in the role of actor or actress who interacts with texts and not based on social position, the perspective of performing changes from commentary to main text. In Cervantes, we find points of contact with contemporary performance traditions beyond the established commedia. Here I would like to single out an interaction with a devil figure who is part of a traveling troupe in the Quixote, and cast a look at the visibility of older traditions in theater text with Pedro de Malas from his Ocho Comedias y Intermedios Nunca Representados. In the Quixote we have the little devil figure, Moarracho, dressed in the matter of the Moriganga, spooking Rocinante enough to have him throw his master into the dust. You'll likely be familiar with the quote. He encounters the company, one of the little devil is dressed in the matter of the Moriganga here. Moriganga, he has an outfit with lots of little bells, and he is carrying a very certain kind of staff. So the troupe that Quixote encounters is on their way to playing an auto during Corpus. Corpus as the most laden of religious festivals regarding Spanish theater iconography. Yet the Morriguero fits a much older pattern of mask bearer within structures of the feast, and has been integrated as such also into the official Christian Corpus processions. His clothes are, as mentioned, covered with bells, and he carries a staff adorned with pig's bladders. One of the very, very few parts of a pig one can actually not eat, not even in Spain. So those were usually filled with water. His movements are dictated by grotesque jumps. With the staff, he beats the ground. In newer iterations, to make way for the actual procession that follows him, in older traditions also to signal the place of the ritual. The staff had powers ascribed to it. Remnants of this belief are still recognizable in descriptions that, for example, the Morriguero touched the young and married woman with his staff, probably gesturing back to beliefs of fertility. The Morriguero, also as Mojarrillo or Vejiguero, is linked to the Moriganga, which, if you look back to Rojas for a moment, he also lists as another type of troupe. Here is it written as Moriganga. We have in this an overlapping set of traditions, because there is, of course, at the latest stage, the literarized Moriganga as a genre of farce, as with, for example, here Calderon's Moriganga de las Visiones de la Muerte. This Moriganga is generally linked to carnival, often sneered at for excessive use of vulgar language, all roots of sorts of reversals, notably of class and gender, excessive physicality, and an overload of dance and music. As already mentioned, Catalina Boezo has done detailed and sensitive research on the genre and offers contact points for a more strongly ethnologically oriented approach. For of course all these irregulations and excesses of the Moriganga are at the very foundations of what the Moriganga was before that. Part of a mask presentation in the feast context, which very purpose is reversals, masks, and an intensified physicality. Also in its linking the representation to the following shared dance as a physical space with everyone involved, both the performers and the spectators. It is an adapted feast tradition, then, that is sometimes looking out of sorts with a later context that prioritizes different elements of performance, like structuring through written text and not through a physical rhythm, and an integration into urban performance politics rather than into carnivalesque season-bound rituals. One of such older ritual-shaped examples that has retained its form outside professional theater is, for example, the famous carnival tradition of the Entierro de la Sardina, which in a depiction by José Solano I have used as the title graphic for this paper. But the Moriganga does not stop there either. The figure of the Morriguero as a trickster-like devil, or its mask-bearing representation, who has a specific repertory of gestures and powers associated with them, is likely an even older configuration within a pagan belief system linked to a space within the mythological, like a mythological structuring or world perception. If we only look at Calderon and some of the oddities that may prevail even under his masterful grasp, we fail to recognize the semantic underbelly of, for example, the Moriganga and its organization along the lines of rhythm and physical action that, curiously enough, are much later an element that expressively draws Camus to Spanish Baroque theater at large. So could there still be a link? The other previously mentioned example of a non-literary approach to early modern performance practices happens in what may have been a reading drama in Cervantes' Pedro de Urdimalas. The figure of Pedro de Urdimalas is another example of a trickster, amply represented also beyond written pieces in folklore, in song, and proverb until present day. Like the mojiguero, he is linked to a specific set of knowledge and practices that far predate the arrival of a professional theater culture on Spanish soil. Cervantes' comedy is another metatextual approach as to what are the roots of performing on one hand and what makes an actor on the other. Pedro himself, in the play, stems from an uncertain background. He is, like the mythical trickster, without a social biography. He is a scoundrel and a swindler who touches upon all performance fields such as jurisdiction, pandering, and nomadism. Adventures which, by the end of the play, have equipped him with everything he needs to know to be a professional actor. Actually, he already is an actor, only now he starts to referring himself as such. It is all the more telling that, as a professional actor, Pedro fashions himself a social biography, making him localizable in adapting the name of Nicolás de Ríos, who was an actual player on the then early professional theater scene around 1600, as an actor, a playwright, and as a troupe leader. In summarizing what makes an actor at this point, Cervantes steps away from the genealogy of the social outcast and swindler and draws up a list that is in concordance with the Comedia Nueva, mentioning text memory, diction, body shape, costumes, other trappings, and removing himself from what he has effectively shown for the 3 acts before to be the more direct qualifications of performance, which is to swindle your way just through everything. A final example, once more linked to a literary genre that makes use of older performance patterns, can be found in the entremés work of Cosme Pérez, better known under his stage name of Juan Rana, who worked with regular texts, but used older, more physically structured techniques such as multiplying or dividing selves or dance as a matter of transportation. Perhaps most exemplary in his El Infierno de Juan Rana, a take on the aforementioned journey to the other world, so typical in negotiating authority over life and death. It's from the middle of the 17th century, so far only scarcely edited as far as I know, but it's available also as a digital manuscript from the Biblioteca Nacional. Pérez performed through the acting persona of Juan Rana, a clownish type, which then again slipped into a variety of roles and disguises. The primary narrative then was Juan Rana more than the texts he worked with. In El Infierno de Juan Rana, we have Rana as the mayor of a small village community, which is one of his standard disguises. He then gets summoned to the underworld by Pluto himself to please judge a gaggle of newly condemned souls, because Pluto apparently doesn't have the time. The 4 devils who come to pick Rana up are all versions of himself. We have the mayor, the simpleton, Cosme, and Rana. And Rana looks at them and says, "Oh, what disguise is this?" They proceed then to travel to the underworld by simply carrying once around the stage and dumping him. He's like, "We've arrived, you've arrived." And he says, "Oh yeah, well, it's always easy to get in here." They dress Rana as one of their own, and he protests the horns and says, "I don't want those." And then Rana proceeds to dole out sentences that ignore established frameworks of propriety or morality until he is finally told he will have to speak to his own soul, who arrives played by Rana's long-term stage partner, Bernarda Ramirez, but he does not even remember his soul going missing. So he stands there, looks at his soul and says, "Oh, did you leave me? I didn't notice." So we have death and afterlife, in short, challenged by a humorous approach, and finally, after he and his soul have made up, they return to the retiro by the matter of dance. We find in Pérez performances a mediating stance when it comes to negotiating fatality, remnants of an anthropological order of a more holistic kind. Into Spanish Baroque theater, these traditions, still visible at the center of urban theater with Rana's performances in the mid-17th century, carry a vitality and physicality that is not based in the written text. Camus has not had direct or, as far as we know, conscious contact with these other theaters of the Siglo de Oro. Their influence on theatrical thought in Siglo de Oro representation practice, however, even if relegated to the unruly margins, might be a contribution to the very vitality of Spanish Baroque that we should not so easily discard. Merci beaucoup.